I have this titled Nationalism and State Building, which is part of what we'll discuss, but we're also going to discuss a number of reform efforts that were taking place in the 19th century. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the United States because I'm an American historian, so I'm more familiar with those efforts. However, similar efforts are going on around the world, and in fact, the vast majority of them not starting in the United States. Let me just point that out. So let's get started. These are some terms I want you to be familiar with, especially nationalism. After we talked about all the isms, while all of them are going to assist you in a deeper understanding of what's going on, nationalism is probably one of the most important. So please familiarize yourself with those terms. So let's talk about nationalism and state building before we get into talking about the reform efforts. In France, Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected president of France's Second Republic in 1848. The National Assembly refused to change the constitution so that he could run for a second term, so, keeping it real like his uncle did, he organized a coup d'etat, and he seized power on December 2nd, 1851. He granted universal male suffrage, and the next year voters supported him in establishing the Second Empire and made him emperor. So, once again, just like his uncle. He promoted public works, financial institutions, and railroad construction. He definitely held the government with a tight fist, but he established several reforms when it suited him. So more examples, he kept bread prices low, he instituted a voluntary social insurance, and a partially legalized labor union, so rather advanced. He had several foreign adventures that won him prestige at first, but this eventually led to his downfall. He joined Piedmont in the war against Austria with the intent of having Italy under his rule, but when he saw that this was not going to happen, he wound up making peace with Austria. In 1861, he made advances in Asia, wanting to establish France as a colonial power once again. He invaded what we now know as Vietnam, which led to free passage of French warships to Cambodia, which Cambodia became a French protectorate in 1863. By having this free passage, it gave freedom for French Christian missionaries to enter the area, and it also provided France with extra cash. So this sounds very similar to the initial Age of Exploration, doesn't it? Glory, God, and gold. Let's see. So France also took part in the Second Opium Wars in China. He attacked Korea, and that really opened the doors for years of French influence in East Asia. In 1862, he went to North America. If you remember your American history, this is during the American Civil War. He wanted to recognize the Confederate States of America as a means of gaining a military alliance. He also wanted control over Latin America. He never openly intervened in the American Civil War, though. He established a puppet government in Mexico City under an emperor named Maximilian. In 1865, when the American Civil War ended, the Americans wound up supporting the Mexican cause. So a few years later, Napoleon III was forced to withdraw his troops, and Maximilian was executed by Mexican forces. Ultimately, this further decreased his popularity among the French, and in 1870, Napoleon III went to war against Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War, where he was captured and exiled to England, where he died in 1873. Germany was really just a group of independent states in the early 19th century. There was a very loose German confederation, but it really wasn't that much. But nationalism was on the rise there, just like everywhere else in the Western world. Germany looked to unite under Prussia. Now, Prussia was this small nation, but it was an incredibly impressive force, and it was the military powerhouse in the 19th century. So Germany is looking to unite under Prussia. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War began. Austria was provoked into war against Prussia, and Prussia overwhelmed Austria and won the war in just 7 weeks, one of the shortest wars, right? Austria was expelled from the German Confederation, and Germany annexed several German states that had sided with Austria to begin with. Prussia became the leader of the new Northern German Confederation. There were some southern German states that remained independent, and there was a man behind the scenes sort of orchestrating everything that was going on. His name was Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck instigated a war against France. The Franco-Prussian War began in 1870. The Prussians, once again, were victorious. They'd even captured Napoleon III, as we mentioned just a little while ago. When this news reached Paris, the Second Empire of France was overthrown, and the Third French Republic was declared. The German states now were fully united, and it became known as the Second Reich. Germans considered the Holy Roman Empire as the First Reich, and again, if you remember your world history, you'll know that the Third Reich was under Adolf Hitler. This is just for funsies. Abraham Lincoln by day and by night. Hope you enjoyed that. Okay, so in the United States, almost all white men gained the right to vote. And the nation was in many ways prospering beyond imagination. I mean, the U.S. even went to Japan, which had become a modern industrialized country, to spread its commercial interests. But a growing division between the North and the South threatened national unity. And this division had been there since the very beginning. If you remember when we discussed the American Revolution, slavery was a very sticky issue, and Northerners basically brushed it under the rug so that their Southern brothers would fight with them during the Revolution. So, slavery, kind of a big issue here. The North, very much based on free labor. This is the idea, not that people come and work for free, right? But the idea that they are not enslaved. They are there by choice, okay? So the North is based on free labor and industrialization, whereas the South remained very much agriculturally based. They are not, they're not run by factories and machines and all of that. No, no, no. This is still very agricultural. Plantations and farms. They depended on plantation crops, particularly cotton, and of course slave labor. The two main issues at hand were states' rights over federal power and the use of slave labor. Abraham Lincoln in 1858, during some presidential debates, said, "This government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not believe it will fall, but I do believe it will cease to be united." And he was right. It was very prophetic. He saw the writing on the wall and called it like it was. In 1861, the American Civil War began, and it was the bloodiest war since the Napoleonic Wars, leaving over 600,000 people dead. Slavery was ultimately abolished, and the Union was spared. So, promise we'd talk about this. Here we go. We're getting into the reform efforts now, and let's talk about the one that was most present probably on most Americans' minds. Congress considered slavery so controversial that in 1836, the House of Representatives, largely at the insistence of Southerners, they passed a gag rule prohibiting discussion or debate of the subject. So Congress said, you cannot talk about this. In 1836, the House of Representatives said, you cannot talk about slavery. You cannot debate the subject because it was considered that controversial. Not all Americans who opposed slavery favored just putting an end to it. Some considered slavery to be wrong, but they were unwilling to take action against it. There were others, however, who accepted slavery in the states where it already existed, but they opposed its expansion into new territories. Abraham Lincoln would be a fairly good example of that. An early anti-slavery proposal was to repatriate slaves to Africa. Advocates of an immediate end to slavery were known as abolitionists. American Anti-Slavery Society, which was organized in 1833, called for the immediate abandonment, that's a quote, of slavery without compensation to slaveholders. The end to the domestic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade was over, but the domestic slave trade, meaning that the enslaved are being traded within the borders of the United States. So these abolitionists, they want an end to the domestic slave trade, and rather radically, they want the recognition of equality between blacks and whites. But abolitionists were divided on how to best achieve these goals. Resistance to slavery took several forms. Slaves would pretend to be sick. They would refuse to work, do their jobs poorly. Sometimes they would participate in sabotage, so destroying farm equipment, setting fire to buildings, stealing food. And these were all mostly individual acts rather than part of an organized plan of revolt. But the objective was to upset the routine of the plantation in any way possible. And any of these could definitely do that. Although there were many enslaved people who tried to run away, few succeeded for more than a few days. This was actually a fairly common practice. They would often run off into the woods or run to go see a spouse or a child who was on a neighboring plantation. Sometimes they did it as a means to show that they still had some sort of power in the relationship between themselves and those who would claim ownership on them. But for the most part, most would actually return on their own. As advertisements in Southern newspapers seeking the return of runaway slaves made clear, the goal of most runaways was to find their wives or children who had been sold to another planter, as already said. The Underground Railroad, which was a series of safe houses for runaways organized by abolitionists and run by former enslaved people like Harriet Tubman, helped about 1,000 slaves reach the North. So this is good. This is very, very good. Now, a lot of people make a really big deal of the Emancipation Proclamation, and this was huge for a number of different reasons. But in some ways, we've sort of enlarged it to be more than what it actually was. We often think that the Emancipation Proclamation was Abraham Lincoln speaking and saying, there is no more slavery, nobody should be enslaved, slavery's done. In some ways it does that, but the Emancipation Proclamation, it emphatically stated that any state who would respond, who would come back into the Union before January 1, 1863, would be able to keep slavery. Abraham Lincoln's main goal was preservation of the Union, not the abolition of the slaves. And this is something that I think we tend to overlook, because he is the president during the American Civil War. He does what he sets out to do, and that is to make sure that the Union is preserved. But he also dislikes slavery. That stated, he's willing to keep it if it means the Union will stay together. So we just need to keep that in mind, because people are people, and people want what they want, right? And we've talked about this before. People are sinners. At our core, we are not good. So even Abraham Lincoln said, I am willing to keep slavery if it means the preservation of the Union. So this is a heady debate. It's coming from the top down, from the bottom up, right? There's different ways to go about attacking slavery, but what about defending slavery? What about the people who said, slavery's fine? the moral attack that the abolitionists mounted against slavery called for a new defense from the South. So rather than emphasize that slavery was a profitable labor system essential to the health of the Southern economy, we start seeing slavery's defenders using the Bible and history and so-called science to defend their reasonings for keeping slavery intact. They very much misquoted scripture and used scripture out of context, and they used so-called support from the Bible, saying that you could find slavery in both the Old and New Testaments, and that God was not just okay with this, but that He expected it and even encouraged it. So again, very much taken out of context. And if you have more questions about the Bible and slavery, feel free to either email me or set up an appointment with me, and we can talk more about it in detail. Using history, defenders of slavery said that all of the great civilizations of the ancient world, like Egypt, like Greece, like Rome, all of these were slave societies. And since they were slave societies, if we were going to be a great society, we should have slavery too. Probably the most ludicrous defense of slavery was that enslavement was actually good for African Americans. By this time, there really are no more people from Africa. They're all African Americans. Defenders of slavery claimed that the enslaved were happy and content under the paternal care of their master and his family, toward whom the enslaved felt a very special affection. Talk of liberty, talk of freedom, that was irrelevant because slaves couldn't even understand those concepts. Defenders of slavery also maintained that the enslaved on plantations in the South were actually better off than the quote-unquote wage slaves in northern factories, where business owners had no real investment in their workers. They didn't provide housing, they didn't provide clothes, they didn't provide food, they didn't provide protection, medical care. So, of course, the enslaved are better off than the white wage slaves of the North. That is their argument. Harsh masters, more often than not, were Northerners who had moved to the South, they claimed, rather than those born and bred in the South. Underlying all of these arguments was a fundamental belief in the superiority of whites. Obviously, I mean, that comes out quite a bit. And we're still struggling with this today. This is a deep-rooted stronghold in our country. And I'm praying, and I ask that you pray with me too, that God would heal our land from racism, that God would heal our land and heal us and bring us to a point of reconciliation where we are no longer divided by the color of our skin. So anyway, that is my prayer, especially in light of current events. Okay, so let's talk about the Dred Scott decision. We've got a lot of different things going on during this time. So, as an enslaved man, Dred Scott had been taken by his master from the slave state of Missouri to the free state of Illinois, and then on to the free territory of Wisconsin, where they lived during the 1830s. After his master died, Scott tried to buy his freedom, but that failed. And when that failed, he went to the courts. He claimed that although he had been brought back to Missouri, his past resident in a free state and free territory made him a free person. He makes a very good argument. Like, hey, I was brought into free territory. My master died. How can I still be held as enslaved by his heirs? Justice Taney's decision basically, it effectively rejected Scott's claim from the outset because he stated that Scott was a slave and therefore not a citizen of either the U.S. or of Missouri. He's not a citizen at all. And since he was not a citizen, he had no right to bring suit in the federal courts. The Dred Scott decision ultimately states that those of African descent are not citizens. If those of African descent, whether slave or free, are not citizens, they are not protected by the law. This is not good. And we see at the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, we see Jim Crow laws being introduced. New state legislatures adopting these so-called black codes or Jim Crow laws. It was designed to keep the newly freed African Americans or freedmen in their place. African Americans were required to either sign labor contracts or face arrest for vagrancy, and they were not allowed to serve on juries. They were not allowed to testify in court. So these are really intense times for African Americans. Very, very scary time as well. In the first half of the 19th century, politicians either ignored or avoided a number of social issues, like we discussed with Congress placing a gag rule on the discussion or the debate of slavery. Politicians ultimately are just turning away from different social issues. But other than slavery, what are some of the other things that are going on? Well, alcoholism was rampant, and so we see the introduction of the temperance movement. The quality of public education was questioned, so there is a movement to improve that. Again, slavery and women's rights as well. So all of that begins to crop up. And reformers, working as individuals as well as through organizations, ultimately were left to tackle these problems on their own. By the early 19th century, the per capita consumption of hard liquor, so that's like whiskey, brandy, rum, gin, things like that, that had grown dramatically to more than 5 gallons a year. The high level of consumption was blamed for poverty because working men would spend their wages on alcohol instead of spending it on rent or food, and this also increased their absence from factory jobs. Alcohol abuse was also contributed to the abuse of wives and children. So in 1826, the American Temperance Society began a very persistent campaign against the evils of drinking. The movement caught on, particularly in New England, much less so in the South, but particularly in New England. And by the 1840s, national alcohol consumption had dropped to half of what it had been just 2 decades earlier. So, and all of this, for the most part, the American Temperance Society was very much run by women. All of these reform movements that we're talking about, the vast majority of them started and were motivated and fulfilled, as it were, through women. So keep that in mind. The demand for free public education grew during the 1830s as the franchise expanded. The franchise meaning the vote, right? So as more people were being allowed to vote, and in the 1830s this would have been more white men. So we're seeing more white men getting the right to vote. There is a desire to have better education and expanded free education. Mostly, education was deemed important for creating an informed electorate. You need people who know how to read and who can think through problems voting, right? In addition, factory workers wanted their children to have more opportunities than they had, and schooling was seen as the best way, as one of the best ways to assimilate children of immigrants through the inculcation of American values. Already existing schools taught the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, or reading, writing, arithmetic, right? They would teach this to a room full of boys and girls whose ages might have run from 3 to 18. Reformers found that system inadequate. Oh, you think? And this was inadequate. This didn't prepare students to succeed in such a rapidly changing society. Massachusetts, as it did during the colonial period, took the lead in promoting education. In 1827, Massachusetts passed a law that provided for the establishment of high schools and set guidelines for curricula based on community size. One of the results of the changes to education was an increase in women teachers. The first high school for girls was opened in New York in 1821. Oberlin College was established as a co-educational institution in 1833. This is huge. Women and men going to school together. Doesn't seem like much to us, but this was huge back then. Mount Holyoke Women's College was founded in 1837, and Judson College in the South, in Marion, Alabama, began in 1838. Why do I know this? Because it was my undergraduate institution. Love me some Judson. Anyway, so educational reform was more successful in the North than in the South, where white illiteracy was high. African Americans did not really benefit from improvements in public education. Free blacks attended poor segregated schools. The enslaved generally received no formal education at all. There are some very, very few exceptions, but those are very few and far between. Again, one institution of higher learning, Oberlin College, admitted blacks as well as women. So Oberlin College is really kind of on the fringe, as it were. They're rather radical. Not only are they allowing women in as students, they are allowing African Americans as students as well. The various reform movements, once again, of the 19th century gave women, especially middle-class women, an opportunity to participate in public life. And, as I mentioned earlier, they were mainly successful in their efforts. A prime example is the work by Dorothea Dix, who worked to create a public mental health institution that would provide humane care for the insane. American women turned their attention to their own situation when activists split from the abolitionists. You see, a lot of women were working as abolitionists. And in 1840, there's a lot of women who go from America to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and the women were snubbed. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to have any participation whatsoever, and they were even at first roped off and said that they were not necessarily allowed to come in. So after this happens, we see 100 women meeting in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And there are some men there as well. Let's point that out. I'm not a She-Ra man-hater here. There are some men who see the light, and they are very much supportive of their wives, their sisters, and of women's rights in general. Seneca Falls ultimately was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, both abolitionist activists, and they worked on drafting a sentiment of women's rights. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions called for equality for women before the law. And this is, again, kind of big because there are a lot of laws that do not help women during this time. So they call for changes in divorce laws, because divorce laws automatically gave custody of children to the husband, and women were not allowed to have access to them. Equal employment opportunities, as well as the right to vote, were other important demands. Just to show off my office a little bit, I have a copy of the Women's Declaration of Independence, 1848, and if you would ever like to come see it, you may just make an appointment. All right, so I like to give you guys a laugh every now and then. So that concludes the discussion here on nationalism and 19th century reform movements.